Good morning, everyone. My name is Maria Clayton, and I am a Senior Manager at MMP working out of our Cambridge office. And I am delighted to have the opportunity to address to you for a few moments and introduce your speaker, Murray Smith, from the Achievement Center for the Business Growth Series session called Mastering the Communication Process. MMP is a fastest growing national accounting and tax business consulting firm in Canada. We have proudly served in response to the needs of our clients in the public, private, and non-for-profit sectors. We are proud to support organizations like the Chamber of Commerce and align our partnership with our commercial. Let me try that again. We are proud to support organizations like the Chamber of Commerce, a partnership that aligns our commercial spirit and demonstrates our values of leadership, excellence, and commitment to enhance our community where we live and work. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning. Murray is a principal with the Achievement Center, a Canadian company that helps organization leaders to make better decisions and bridge the gap between knowing what to do and doing it. Murray helps business achieve better results with result-focused sales training, leadership development, employee engagement, and strategic planning. For 11 years, Murray was a part-time faculty member at Conestoga College School of Business, teaching leadership and organizations behavior for courses to our future business leaders. Murray is also a member of the board of directors at the Cambridge Chamber of Commerce. He brings his real world experience to the workplace, the classroom, and the boardroom. Murray engages people in result-focused learning experience. Please help me welcome Murray. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria, and thank you to MNP for sponsoring this event. Just give me a moment here while I share my screen, and we will get started. Okay. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. This course is being done by technology, and sometimes technology fails. So we have Melissa in the background. She's the wizard behind the curtain that will make sure that things continue the way they're supposed to. I'm told that we have perhaps as many as 17 people on this webinar today, which is great. It also means that we can be a little bit interactive. We have a lot to cover in 60 minutes, but if you would like to use the chat or the Q&A feature, I will do my best to keep track of that, and Melissa will also chime in if I'm falling behind. I'll stay at the end for a little bit of question and answer as well. Melissa said she can keep the channel open for a few minutes afterwards, and I'd be happy to do that. If you're interested in receiving the slides from this presentation, I'll be happy to send those to you. Just send me an email and I will send them out this afternoon. Well, communication, one of the biggest challenges that we have and in building businesses and in building relationships. The blurb that promoted this event had included these words: becoming a great communicator begins with being a great listener. It is human nature to focus on what to say next instead of listening to what the other person has to say. It's an important truth to internalize, that this is what we tend to do. We have the skills to communicate. We can speak, we can listen, we can see, we can read body language, we can do all of those things, but we're actually not that good at it naturally. We're good at talking, not so great at communicating. One of the services that the Achievement Center offers for employee engagement is an employee engagement survey that we call the Core Survey. And it asks a whole lot of questions and a number of different competencies within an organization. But among those are questions around communication competencies, organizational communication, communication from leaders, a number of them around communication. Now, here's the interesting thing about those scores. They are almost always the lowest set of scores in the entire survey. And they are low by about a 2-point delta. Every one of these survey questions is scored out of 10. And a good company receives an average score of 8 or more, one that's doing well. And those companies that receive that average score, say 8.5, will typically have a communication score of between 6.5 and 7. So why is that? It's a good company. It scores really well on all aspects except communication. And it's not about the ability to communicate messages, to give messages. We're using one communication tool right now, this webinar platform. We have more communication tools available to us than we ever have before. Communication or complaints about communication tends to be the bucket into which other complaints are also put when they can't be identified somewhere else. So they really are more about being heard or being seen or being felt to be valued. It's about really, do I have the sense that my leaders or my organization care about me? And so our objective in today's webinar are to discuss this idea about communicate by listening. Now, this is hard and it's not natural for us as problem solvers. And if you're here because you're in a management role or a supervisory role or any role in which you have people that report to you, one of the reasons that you are in that role, one of your jobs is to solve problems. And when people bring a problem to you, or to me, the instinct is to solve that problem on its face, the thing that they're bringing. But sometimes that's not the thing that needs to be solved. Sometimes and quite often, in fact, there are deeper issues underlying that problem that is presented. And so it is up to us to figure that out. So we're going to identify practical skills that will allow you to communicate by listening. And if we get good at this, as we get better at this, then this strengthens leadership influence. This is also important even if you're not in a formal leadership role, because leadership is not just about the title or the position that one has. It is about the influence that we have with people. So we lead up and across as well as into our specific leadership responsibilities. So we're going to talk about communicating and listening, and the listening side of communication. Listening and listening well and understanding deeply is a foundation of your ability to coach people for success rather than police for failure. In many, many places, we tend to respond to situations by policing them, by giving direct instructions, by challenging people to correct their mistakes, by catching things when they go wrong rather than when they are going right. Instead, if we adopt the idea of coaching as a sports metaphor can work, we're being proactive to develop people, proactive to give them strength and give them tools to be able to solve the problems themselves so that they are less likely to have to come to us to solve them. And isn't that what we want to do as leaders of positive influence, is to build and strengthen and delegate. So we're going to build that coaching foundation. This strengthens relationships of trust, and trust is fundamental to every relationship, and it deepens engagement with people within your organization. So I'd like to now ask Melissa if she would set up a poll for us. It's just a quick introductory poll, and you have one of 5 choices to rate yourself on your listening for communication. So the first one, you tend to just get the gist of the message and then offer your advice. The second one, listen carefully to know what to say. The third, I pay attention and give listening cues like head nods and verbal cues. I listen carefully. Number 4, I listen carefully and sometimes ask clarifying questions. And I listen with empathy and ask several questions to deepen my understanding. Okay, Melissa, I think you've given us the final tally. So it looks like happily, most of you answered between 3 and 5, with question number 4 edging things out just a little bit. That's good news. Okay, I think I can exit this. All right, so let me move on to the next slide. This is a great quote. Communication is the real work of leadership. Communication is the real work of leadership. We often get confused and think that leadership is about getting people to do things. Well, yes, that is. That's part of the role that we have. But communication is central to influence. The essence of leadership is relationships and influence. You can be a boss or a manager and get things done without really being a leader. And you can also be in a position where you don't have formal authority and be a leader because you have influence, because you have been good at communicating. Influencing is a process. It is about communicating ideas, purpose, meaning that leads to the motivation of followers and allows you to support them as they implement ideas and plans. And this is especially important in organizations going through change. Now, as the relationship grows and as trust grows, then as a leader, you're able to share your leadership through delegation and through training, because as commitment grows, then people are willing to be influenced and able to do more. Now, what gets in the way of communication, this real work of leadership and communication? Well, we all have listening blind spots. We all have communication blind spots. And some of them are triggered by emotions, especially stress. We get stress responses to things. And we end up not listening to the real issue as a result. Let me give you an example of this. Here's a stress response from somebody that I was doing some training with. He's an engineer, project manager, and we were talking about this particular situation of stress responses and communication. And he told the story about his interior designer coming to him. They were finishing up a project, a building, and the interior designer came and asked a very simple question. Should we use, regarding the carpet tiles that we're going to go into a reception area floor, should we use square carpet tiles or rectangular carpet tiles? Simple question. And his response was, I don't care. It's your job. You make the decision. Okay. So what message did he give to his designer? Did he really not care? Of course he cared. But he was under stress, and he was right. It was the designer's job to make the decision. But here's the question. Why was she asking that question in the first place? And as we had this conversation, he recognized that there was a deeper reason for asking the question. It wasn't just a simple question of square versus rectangle, but what was causing that? Was there a budget issue that she couldn't find the one that was specified within the budget that needed to be fulfilled? Or were the square ones specified but not available, and so could she use rectangular ones? Or was it color? Was it pattern? Was it any number of things that he didn't listen for? Here's another one. One of my college students was telling me about his work experience. He was a co-op student, and he had the opportunity to be a supervisor in a manufacturing plant, a junior supervisor role in the factory. So he was meant to be mentored and helped along the way, because after all, he was a college student in a very junior role. And anytime there was a problem that would come up, and he would go to his supervisor, his mentor, and ask the question, especially if it was a problem that needed to be solved. The response he got was, own it, figure it out. which on its surface is fine. It's a good start if the coaching follows to help him figure it out. But this young man was left to figure it out on his own. And his impression that he was left with was that the supervisor didn't care for him, didn't care whether he succeeded. The supervisor was more concerned about protecting himself and his interests rather than investing the time necessary to train up this young man. Some other messages we don't mean to send is the eye roll. Oh, I've heard this before, and you probably have. Or expressions like, they always ask me these questions, and maybe even expressing displeasure at the capacity or the capability of a certain cohort. Several years ago, the complaint was all about millennials. Now, some millennials were probably a problem, but so were some baby boomers. So we send these messages we don't intend to send when we do this. So this is the next question is, when we do these things, when we are not careful with the blind spots, what are the messages that we tend to send? Well, these are some possible interpretations that people will understand from the messages that we send. I am right. Well, you probably are. That's why you were in the position that you are in. But that doesn't help grow the person that has come to you with a question. I have the best ideas, or I don't have the time for you, or you don't know as much as I do. You're in my way. You're in the way of progress. You're in the way of closing this deal. You're in the way of finishing this project. Now, those first 5 are simply demonstrate neglect and arrogance and disrespect. These next 2 are much more bullying behaviors. So if somebody comes with a different idea, rather than listening, well, I can wear you down. I can wear down your objections and I will win. Or I can use persuasion and manipulation or coercion to get my way, because I have that kind of authority. I have power in my position to be able to do that. Well, none of this is listening. None of this builds relationships. None of this allows us to build our relationships and strengthen our businesses. So we've outlined a number of the communication objectives and challenges, but what's the solution here? Some of you may have read Stephen Covey's excellent book from about 30 years ago entitled The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Among those 7 habits is habit number 5, and it is seek first to understand and then to be understood. Seek first to understand and then to be understood. Now, I read this book 25 years ago, and I've read it a couple of times since. In my first reading of the book, I read that and I nodded my head and said, oh, okay, yes, well, you got to get the facts, you got to understand the position, got to get the lay of the land, gather in all the information so that I can make a judgment based on data. You know, that's the kind of thinking, and that has a degree of accuracy to it. You want to get the good information. But as I've matured, and as I've been involved in leadership over those 25 years, I've begun to understand that it is that and more. And the seeking first to understand has a lot more to do with being empathetic, of listening with empathy to a person, to understand the true meaning of the question, the problem, the challenge, or to be able to present meaning and purpose and value in something that I am communicating to somebody. So we want to develop empathy in our communication. This empathy meets the problem that I presented earlier about that low communication score relative to all of the other scores on the employee engagement surveys. What they're really saying is, I don't feel like I'm receiving the empathy that I need. And so empathy encourages engagement of people for the business and within its mission and vision. That engagement then changes resistance into compliance and then commitment. See, when we go back to that story about the engineer and the project manager, the answer, well, I don't care, you make the decision, it's your job. Well, she went away from that not feeling heard and not feeling like she was cared about. And therefore, her commitment to her manager was taken down a few notches. Now, it's human nature, and if that's just the one and only time that it happens, or it happens rarely, then that equilibrium will come back into place the way it should. But if we do this consistently, we change committed, dedicated individuals into resistors. And that's not something that we want to do. This is not the easiest thing in the world to do. It has its challenges. It is something that needs to be learned. And it's something that I work on all the time, and I do this for a living. And so to communicate by listening requires us to learn how to do it, to be aware of ourselves and our own triggers within this, and then to practice, practice, practice. So here's a question for you. You can write it down in a notebook. You don't have to share it. But do you have a communication habit that you're aware of that can cause blind spot consequences that I've just described? So do you have a communication blind spot? Maybe you've got a normal response or an instinctive response when you get to someone who maybe is frustrating you. Write that down. Here's the one that I typically have. I have a bit of a competitive streak. And so I have a tendency to cut people off who are expressing their ideas with my idea, to make it better, of course. But I'm too quick. I'm too quick to add to their idea, which usually diminishes their idea. It has the effect of diminishing them. Or I'm too quick to solve a problem or offer a solution to a problem which has not been fully defined. Now, I practice this so I can be halfway into the thought of wanting to offer the advice to solve the problem. And most of the time I can catch myself, pull myself back, and ask a question. That's a theme you're going to see throughout the balance of this presentation, is the power of asking questions. So I'm asking you to write it down so that you can acknowledge it, but also so that you can see, as we go through the balance of this presentation, some ideas that will help you respond better than your natural instinct. So the specific communication situation that we're talking about, communication is a broad subject, and it covers everything from, pardon me for that, it covers everything from what I'm doing with you now, which is presenting things directly, to the one-on-one communication that we would expect. I think I heard a signal beep, and I haven't figured out how to see the Q&A. So Melissa, if there's something coming up, let me know.
All right, there's nothing at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So the specific, let's narrow this to a specific kind of situation where you have a one-on-one communication with somebody. It may be around a project or a problem or a personal situation, but we're in a one-on-one situation. Someone comes to you with a question, and if you're like most people, your brain triggers, and you have advice, solutions, wise counsel, all based on experience, and it's probably right. But the problem is, if you give that advice too soon, you get the yeah, but response. Have you noticed that? You get the yeah, but response. Why is that? Well, the person hasn't had the time to process things. We tend to think that our problems are unique and different from everyone else's, when there is a lot of similarity, but we need time to work it through. But more importantly, is that the stated problem, the stated question, is probably only the surface or the tip of the iceberg. There are likely a number of deeper issues that ought to be investigated so that you can get to the root problem. the thing stated is a symptom, we need to get to the root problem. If you think of an analogy here, if someone came into the room and coughed, well, what does that mean? You might recommend that they go home and rest because they have a cold. You might recommend some lemon tea because they must have a sore throat. But they might have just eaten a donut and coughed on a particle of that food. Or they might have come in and got some dust in their mouth. Or maybe they do have a cold. Maybe they do have something more serious. Maybe it's an allergy. Who knows what it is? But if we diagnose if we give advice based on only a symptom, we're not getting to the root cause. So our job is to peel back the layers of the onion, as they say, and ask questions and listen. This process of asking questions and deepening, getting to the deeper issues, lifts and strengthens a person. So my defense, and the defense I would recommend to you if you are inclined to give a quick answer, is stop and ask another question. Tell me more. What do you mean by that? That's an interesting challenge. What can we do to investigate it? You know, those kinds of open-ended questions. Now, I'm going to go next into 7 ideas of how to develop this. Sorry, I missed this slide. This is a simple definition of empathy from Psychology Today. So to be empathetic is the experience of understanding other person's thoughts, feelings, and conditions from his or her point of view rather than from one's own. Notice that shift. We are trying to understand what's going on inside the mind and heart of the other person. So here are the 7 skills that we'll go a little bit deeper into here. These 7 skills of listening come from a book by Richard Himmer called Listen and Lead. It's a wonderful and interesting book. You can get it on Amazon. It's not available in retailers here in Canada. He's a person from Washington State, I think. But I did check to see that it was available on Amazon. My sister, my brother and his wife live in Washington State, and my sister-in-law sent it to me because this is the business that I'm in. So he suggests and offers these 7 ideas to improve communication. These things that we should not do, and then of course they're opposites of what we should do if we want to have better communication. So the first one is, do not offer unsolicited opinions or advice. Now there is a time to offer opinion and advice. It's when it's solicited, not when it's unsolicited. So unsolicited is the instinctive thing that we do when we want to give an answer right away. Someone presents an issue, a problem, a challenge, and you probably have a good piece of advice to give. But if we give it early, they're not ready for it. So other kind of unhelpful advice can be things like, well, that's not so bad. Or, you know, you should do this. Or, in my experience, here's the solution to that problem. And how about, oh, that's a great idea, but if you do just this little extra, it'll make it from a 95% to a 99%. My little idea will make your thing much more brilliant. The other thing we have to be aware of is opinions in disguise, where we say, well, what if you did this? You know, it's gentler, right? What if? Or we listen, we ask a question, then we quickly say, what if you did? There are times to give opinions when they are asked for, when they are solicited. And when we get down to the bottom of this list to number 6 and 7, teach and give small commitments. It's within that period of teaching that the opinions or advice will be solicited. But what's the defense here? It's to ask a question instead. So ask more questions. In fact, there's a principle of question asking called the 5 whys. And the idea behind that is if you ask 5 questions on something, going deeper and deeper each time, often the question is related to a why, but it can be what or how, but 5 times, you are more likely to get to the root cause and be now solving the problem. The next thing we want to watch out for is judgments. Now, this one seems obvious. We don't want to be stern and condescending, but we also want to make sure that we're not making a mistake of empathy. In other words, when we say things like, wow, that's amazing, or that must be hard for you, or you must be sad. Now, those are attempts at empathy, but they are looking at a position or a situation from our own emotional experience rather than understanding the emotional experience of another. So, for example, I could say, my dog died last week. Oh, that must be sad. But maybe my dog had cancer for 6 months and was in a lot of pain, and I was relieved that we finally put the dog down. So, while it is sad, it's a different kind of sad than you may have been thinking about. The worst is to say, oh, I know just what you mean. Because we don't. We may have had a similar experience, but we're not having the same emotion with it. And so ask questions instead. So the question would be, my dog just died last week. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Tell me what happened. Well, he had cancer. And so we had him put down. Oh, okay. How are you feeling about that? And then we can get into a discussion about how I'm feeling, not how you might perceive that I should be feeling. Now, there is a time to offer these kinds of judgments, and that's later on in the teaching in the commitments section. Here's another one, another attempt at empathy, and it's no relating. This is an instinctive attempt at empathy where we try to say, oh, I had an experience just like yours, or I know that experience because. This is a delicate balance. To let somebody know that you have walked that path or a path that is similar is a great way of being vulnerable and of opening yourself up to that person being more open to you. But it also has a risk of changing the attention and focus of this situation to you, the speaker, rather than to the person who has brought the problem. I will give you a personal example this time that I should have known better, but I didn't. In June of 2019, I was at our family cottage with some cousins, and we were doing some spring maintenance on the cottage. My cousin Sue brought her mother, my Aunt Isabel, who was 95 years old. She was the wife of my dad's brother. He has passed away. You may recall that in the winter of that year, 2018, and then in March 2019, two planes crashed that were the Boeing 737 MAX 8s. Now, in March, in the middle of March, I had been in Winnipeg, and the day before the MAX 8 planes were all grounded because of the second plane crash that had happened only a few days earlier, I got on a 737 MAX 8 to fly from Winnipeg to Hamilton. So that's the background. So we're in the cottage, and I was doing some painting around some window frames. Isabel was crocheting on the sofa, and she said, "Did you hear about that plane crash in Africa in March?" And I said, yes, I had heard about it. And she said, my cousin was on that plane. He worked for the United Nations. Now, this was a cousin through her side of the family, so I didn't know that cousin. Now, that's a point for empathy. But here's the thing that I did. My brain triggered. And I thought, oh, MAX 8. I had an experience with a MAX 8. And I told her I had been on one in Winnipeg just before all those planes had been grounded. Now, I know you're all rolling your eyes at me right now, because how could I have been so insensitive? And as soon as those words came out of my mouth, I was having the same feeling as well. my aunt went silent because she had just expressed a very personal and painful experience to me. And she probably brought that up because she trusted me and just needed somebody to express that grief. And I had turned it around about me and my experience on that aircraft. And I had come home safely, of course. Well, I recognized my failure right away, put down my paintbrush, went over beside her on the sofa and asked her some questions about her cousin, what he did for the UN, how the family was, and so on. That's an extreme example of what happens when we try to relate, and that act of relating draws the attention away from the person and puts it back to you or to me, who was the one that was approached. It's dangerous. And so ask another question. The next one is communicate from a neutral position. This has everything to do with our emotions. What happens when someone brings you a challenge that you think that they should have solved in the first place? You get upset. Maybe you don't show it, but in your mind, frustrated. What happens if you're under stress? You get annoyed. What happens if it's the 100th time, or this is something that's on a repeat and they should have learned it by now? All of these are emotional triggers, and emotions are the worst advisors that we can have. So whether it's stress or failed expectations, or we've made emotional investments in people and that they've let us down, this is a hard one, but it's important for us to suppress those emotional biases and be true to the intent, to our intent, which is to help people. So a deadline is missed. What's your response? Anger, frustration? Yeah, of course, that's going to happen. But why was the deadline missed? Sometimes because of these emotions, we allow ourselves to make an attribution error, which is a psychological concept, which means that we tend to blame other people for errors. We tend to blame them personally, that it's their character flaw. This thing was late because you weren't well enough organized with time. This thing was late because there's some flaw in your process. But when it happens to us, we tend to blame an external circumstance. So I'm sorry I couldn't meet this deadline because some documentation that I was expecting from the city, say a building permit, didn't come in, or documentation that I needed from another department, or a question that needed to be answered, or we just couldn't do the research, or the timeline was too tight, whatever. We have reasons, we come up with reasons why it's reasonable that we were not able to meet that expectation. Now, our job now is to figure out what is reasonable and what is not reasonable, so that now we can come to the right solution. Was it my poor time management that meant that I wasn't able to meet that deadline? Well, yelling at me about my time management doesn't solve my time management issues. But understanding that I have time management issues may help you give me time management training, or may help you discover that I have too many things on my plate, that I actually am going to break. The system is going to break because I have too much going on. Or maybe they were extenuating circumstances well outside of my control, and we have to make another plan now to mitigate those. So the next one is avoid communication blind spots. These are some of the things that we talked about earlier, the deflections that we can make, the shortcuts that we take to try to get to the root cause more quickly, but we tend not to. They're the words and phrases that tend to push people away, even though we don't mean to. So the invitation here is to examine your blind spots, especially when you're under pressure. And we use the skills of 1, 2, 3, and 4, so the opposites of what's listed on this list, that we hold our opinions, We ask questions rather than judging. We ask questions rather than relating, and we're careful with our emotions so that we can avoid those blind spots. As we do all of those things, by the way, this is listed in a sequential order because it has to be in a sequential order, but it all happens all at the same time. So you may be teaching throughout, which is our next step. You may be withholding or asking questions to find the right advice so that you can teach. And when you have these moments, then it is time to teach. Now, our tendency is to give instruction. To go, oh yes, check the box, check the box, check the box. Okay, all of these things. Now I know what to tell you to do. And sometimes in an emergency, in a crisis situation, that's what you need to do. But if you do that all the time, they'll keep coming back with questions. If the objective is to build the capacity of the individual, then we want to teach and coach. So we use the situation for a training moment. It may be a 2-minute training or a 10-minute training. We use a situation to help set up delegation and support. And we use our coaching skills. Now, this becomes very important. The teaching and understanding what needs to be taught is critical. I'll give you an example. My daughter, Nicole, was a varsity track athlete with the University of Guelph. She was a 200-meter sprinter. And in her second year, she was at a race at York University, making the turn to come to the finish line, and she pulled a muscle in her leg and fell over. It was a pretty serious injury, and it took the rest of the season for her to heal. But each time she healed and was ready to go, she injured it again. And the injury was more because of a psychological barrier that was left over from that first injury. And so her technical skill in sprinting was perfect. And if the coach continued to teach and coach her on the technical skills of sprinting, it wasn't going to solve her problem. The coach actually had to coach her mental state, had to coach her mind over that barrier, not her legs and not her body. He had to coach her mind over that barrier. And that was what made her successful, so that she had an excellent final year in university as a national champion sprinter. So we ask more questions in order to figure out where to place the instruction, the coaching, and the training. And finally on this list is get small commitments. We can sometimes make the mistake. We can sometimes make a mistake of giving orders and demanding compliance rather than asking if they're willing to take the next step. These are not manipulated commitments, but a small commitment could be, well, okay, are you willing to, let's say it's a project that has 7 steps and it's something that stretches the individual. Well, let's look at the first 2 steps. We've got the 7 steps are mapped out, but let's look at these first 2 steps. Can you get step number 1 finished by Tuesday? Okay, that's a small commitment. I'm not asking you to finish the whole 7-step project, but can you get this next step finished by Tuesday? What do you need me to do to help you get that step finished by Tuesday? These skills, these 7 skills, require communication awareness from ourselves and emotional intelligence to overcome our natural instincts. Because if you take the no away from each of those ones those first 3, our natural instinct is to give opinions and advice. Our natural instinct is to give judgments, positive judgments. We're sometimes negative, and that one shows up more in the communicating from a neutral position. And our instinct is to want to relate, want to be empathetic. It all has its place, but when we do it too soon, we create a barrier in our communication. We do not open up the opportunity to teach. So I'm going to ask Melissa to put up a poll just in a second here, but just to have a look at this list again. These 7 skills require learning and they require practice. The first 3 essentially the defense to those is to ask questions. Number 4 and 5 is to be aware of your personal flight or fight responses and weaknesses. They tend to be more emotional. And then skills 6 and 7, those are your solution skills. And they are advanced as you work on your coaching communication skills of more questions, but seeking to understand and help rather than demand and instruct. So Melissa, if you could put up the slide or the poll. Here's the question. As we finish this off, which of those 7 are you going to start working on today? Notice I'm asking for a small commitment, not all 7, but would you consider one of these and become aware of it and work on it starting today? Okay. So there's no wrong answers in this one. No wrong answers at all. Every answer is right, and I appreciate you being candid with it. My invitation to you is be aware. Having made this commitment on this poll is the first step in being aware. And I can promise you in some of your conversations today, something will come up that will trigger your thoughts. Oh yeah, this is the thing I said I was going to work on. The good news is you can back away from it and you can ask a question. And as you do this more and more, you will find that the questions come more easily. The outcome becomes coaching for success. This is a big part of the training that I do, this idea of coaching for success. The opposite is policing for failure. And I'll give you a quick description of what I mean by this. Something's not going right. Our tendency, our human tendency can be to demand compliance, to get angry, to stomp our feet, to bang on the table, to yell, to get people's attention. And it works. People respond. But it's a false economy because they respond, and then when we go away, the status quo returns. And in fact, we've probably lost a little bit of trust and commitment. And so the performance drops below where it was before. And so we respond again. The performance spikes, and then it drops a little bit lower and lower. And over time, we actually lose the commitment of people, and we lose people. When we coach with people, the performance may go down at the beginning because we're doing our investigation with them. We're learning what they need. But as we coach, we grow them, and we grow them, and we grow them so that their capacity to be able to do the job that they're meant to do and to solve problems that they haven't been able to solve before continues to grow. We have now strengthened the capacity of our team and our organization. Imagine what it'd be like to have 10% more productivity in your organization without adding 10% more people. Well, that is a real outcome of good communication and coaching. These investments pay large dividends. I invite you to practice the 5 whys, which comes from the 6 Sigma approach to problem solving. A person brings you a question or a problem. You engage in a dialogue. You will, of course, answer the question. Ask other questions. Dig deeper, up to 5 times, sometimes even more, to get to that root cause. And then you will know how to really help the person to be able to function on their own. You'll be able to teach. You'll be able to train. You will be able to build their capacity. And in doing so, you strengthen the trusting relationships within the organization. You build teamwork. You build it to a point where you can almost read each other's minds. That kind of commitment then drives the organization forward. There's an excellent book on this called The Speed of Trust by Stephen M. R. Covey. He's the son of the Stephen Covey of the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It's worth a read, but here's the entire book in one statement. When we increase trust in the organization, interpersonal trust in the organization, we decrease the cost of doing business and we increase the speed of doing business. The reason we decrease the cost and increase the speed is because people can do it on their own. They're not covering their back. They're not protecting themselves from threats. They're actually able to engage in defending the organization from external threats rather than defending themselves from internal stresses. So as we come to the end of our discussion today, I'll put this list up again. And you've listed one thing in that poll. So my invitation to you is practice that one skill. Get good at it. Get it so that you recognize when you're falling into that pattern and how to pull yourself out of it. And then monitor for a while, monitor the result that you get. And I think you'll be surprised. People will answer your questions. People will feel more engaged and they will perform better as you ask those questions and answer those questions. Feel free to contact me. I'm going to put up a final slide at the end that has my contact information on it. I'd be happy to talk to you more about communication within your organization and your interpersonal communication as well. This is what I do. I do leadership training. I do coaching and business strategy, sales training, employee engagement, workshops and seminars and surveys and assessments. If you've ever wanted to do an employee engagement assessment or do 360 assessments or things like that, we actually have a sale on it this time, 50% off our regular prices. You can let me know. And if you're interested in looking at ideas for training and development within your organization, I would be pleased to talk to you about that. In these days of COVID, we do a lot of it virtually. When it's appropriate, we will be happy to also come in and do it in person.